move to our third speaker, third and final speaker for this session, Adib Valibeygi. It is a medical student from the Fasa University of Medical Science, supervised by Dr. Moyataba Fareab. And his talk is titled Investigating the Role of Cognitive System in Moral Judgments According to Social Intuition and the Dual Process Theory. Thank you, Adib.
Thank you, Valentina, and thanks to everyone attending my talk. Okay. Our research was an international collaboration between Iran and Italy. We worked on two famous theories on social cognition and social psychology. So my talk will be completely about cognitive neuroscience and cognitive social neuroscience. There are two main approaches to moral psychology. How do cognitive systems play a role in our judgments and decision makings? The first very famous theory is dual process theory. It states that there are two main systems that drive our judgments and decision makings, especially in emotionally and morally charged situations. We have a system one, which is a fast, implicit, and automatic system. It is highly influenced by our previous experiences, our intuitions, and also stereotypes. And we have a second system, which is more analytic. It is slow, deliberative, and rational. Dual process says that we use these
We are not very lucky with internet connection today. So sorry. Let's wait a second and see if Adib comes back. Okay. Sorry, you froze just for a second. So maybe you want to just start over this last sentence. Thank you.
Sure. The social intuitions model says that our judgments are driven by emotions and intuitions, but not rationals. It means that we make judgments and decision making based on our emotions, and our reasoning, our deliberation does not play a major role in our decision makings. And Jonathan Haidt also coined the term moral dumbfounding on this matter. It says that when a person, for example, I believe that incest is absolutely immoral, and I hold this belief, but I cannot exactly explain why. I cannot justify my beliefs. And it says when intuitions find no reason, I find no reason for my intuitions. And it means that I judge and I make decisions based on my intuitions, my previous beliefs, but not reasons. And our study aimed to answer this question. Is it true that, as dual process theory states, the individuals tend to use fast, intuitive cognitive processes when making judgments, and they tend to use deliberation, reasoning, while they're asked for? Or as social intuitionist model states, our judgments are almost always, and basically driven by our emotions and intuitions. So we designed a very simple study had 57 undergraduate students at Fasa University of Medical Sciences, of which 30 were female and 27 participants were male, aged between 19 and 27. We divided our participants into two groups, group 1 and group 2, and they had different procedure, as I will talk about them more in the next slide. And the subjects were unwilling to complete the experiment, or the post-experiment questionnaires were excluded from the study. Our study design and procedure. Our first group participants were presented with a scenario, with 6 scenarios, and they were presented in a random order. Of these 6 scenarios, 2 were control scenarios. These scenarios were free of any emotional or moral load. They were very simple scenarios, including job offer and plan transparent. And we inserted these scenarios in our study because we wanted to make sure that our participants are reading and judging the scenarios correctly. And every participant would answer wrong, who answered wrongly to these scenarios was excluded from the study. And we had also 4 moral scenarios, including incest, footbridge, crying baby, and soldier. And since our time is limited, I cannot explain each scenario separately. But these are very famous, and you can find them on the internet. After that, group 1 participants were presented with the scenarios. They were asked to judge them, whether the character of the scenario has is right. After that, the participants were asked to make explanations. They were asked to justify why they made such decisions. And a few minutes later, they were presented with the same scenarios again, and they were asked to judge them again. And they were able to change their judgments even if they were willing to. And after finishing the procedure, they were provided with demographic form and some questionnaires that I will tell about them more in the next slide to make sure that the 2 groups are equivalent and they are homogeneous. The participants of the second group were as well presented with the same scenarios, but unlike the first group, they were asked to simultaneously judge each scenario and explain their judgments. It means that unlike group 1 participants, they were aware that they are going to come up with explanations for their judgments. They have to justify their judgments. And in the next step, after a few minutes, they were presented with the same scenarios again. And finally, they were presented with demographic forms and psychological questionnaires. Our forms and questionnaires included a demographic form, which included age, gender, ethnicity, religion, marital status, socioeconomic status, and previous history of psychiatric conditions. Also, Beck depression inventory, discuss propensity and sensitivity scale, and Yale-Brown obsessive compulsive scale. All of these questionnaires, these psychological questionnaires, were previously shown to be related with moral judgments. Therefore, we included these questionnaires in our study to make sure that both groups are equivalent and homogeneous in terms of psychological state. Also, every individual with psychiatric conditions and diseases was excluded from the study. 2 of the participants of group 2 were excluded because one of them made a wrong judgment about one of the control scenarios, and another one faced an error with the software. Therefore, we have 29 participants of group 2 and 26 participants of group 1. And our analysis showed that there was no significant difference between the 2 groups in terms of demographic variables or psychological measures. Our analysis showed that there is no significant difference between the primary or secondary judgments of the 2 groups. It means that they almost make the same judgments about all the scenarios and also each scenario individually. The following is the most common judgment the individuals made about each scenario. Both groups, there was no, as I said, there was no significant difference. Both groups judged the incest scenario as morally unacceptable, the footbridge scenario as morally unacceptable, and both crying baby and soldier scenario as morally acceptable. So there was no significant difference between the groups. And as we see in the table, there was near to significant but yet insignificant difference between the 2 groups in terms of revising their judgments in their secondary judgments when they were again presented with the same scenarios in the 3rd step. The p-value was 0.066. It is near to normal, and maybe further studies with higher sample population can find significances in this matter. And our t-test shows that female participants are more prone and they have more tendency to revise their judgments. And this should be also studied more with higher populations. Maybe it means that when they were asked to explain their judgments, they switched between cognitive systems. It needs more studies, and it is very important. Okay, so let's summarize. We have always believed that our moral judgments are the result of our reasoning. Everyone believes this, but our knowledge, at least until now, says no, it is probably incorrect. Especially social intuitionist theory of Jonathan Haidt strongly disagrees this belief. Dual process theory, on the other hand, states that we have two different systems of thinking and decision making and judgments.
I think it's frozen again, but in the meantime, feel free to start writing the questions for Adib. So as soon as he's back, okay. We lost you. We lost you again for a few seconds. No worries.
Okay.
But you can finish your.
Yes, I was saying that our findings support the social intuitions theory. It says that almost always we make judgments based on our intuitions, our emotions, and reasoning does not play a major role. And it is very, very important when we are thinking that we are acting very rationally, we are very reasonable. In fact, we are using mostly our emotions. But as I said, our study has limitations. The most important one is a small sample size of the study, and further studies with probably somehow different designs and higher sample population are required to support or refuse maybe our findings. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is very interesting, and indeed it gives us something to think about when, when you think of how we make decisions. I do have already a couple of questions. Did you see an interaction between the gender, the sex effect of female, male, and the group effect? Like, do females switch opinion more often than male in group 1 than in group 2? Or is the overall effect of gender?
No, the finding that I mentioned here was an overall finding. There was no significant difference between the groups. Both groups showed that females are more prone to revise the judgments.
Okay, interesting. Interesting. And in terms of replications, which rightfully you said larger samples, I also wonder whether you're planning on looking at possible age differences, whether there might be an effect.
Yes, our sample population had a limited age range because we did it in a university, and almost all the participants were young, aged between 19 and 27. But sure, more studies are required with a wider age range and to see whether age has effect on this matter.
Yeah, I'm very naive. I definitely not my field, but my intuition would be that younger would even more rely on emotions and older. But yeah, you're already proving me wrong. So.
Maybe not. No, that's a good idea to work on.
And always in terms of manipulation of the paradigm. So in this study, you were asking them to explain themselves, so like pushing them towards system 2 reasoning.
Yes, exactly.
Are you thinking of sort of flipping the scenario and have a emotional condition in which you sort of push them towards a more fast, emotion-driven? For example, just giving them less time to respond and
Uh,
see if that pushes them to more social like system one, let's say.
I'm not sure you get correct, but in the first step of group one, they were only asked to make judgments, and they were not aware that they are going to explain their judgments. It means that probably if we say based on dual process theory, they are going to use their first system because it is low
Right.
effort. It doesn't work with cognitive capacities. It doesn't use working memory. But in the first step of the group two experiment, they were asked to simultaneously make judgments and justify their judgments. So they had to use probably second cognitive system, which is high capacity. It uses cognitive capacity. It uses working memory and more deliberative.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Really interesting. All three talks, I've learned so much this morning.